you could tell the sports world was trying to figure it out, much like you're trying to figure out the squirrel on the other side of the door right now.
Hey, it's Brian. Welcome to The Other 51. This week, we're talking to Mike Vaccaro of the New York Post about what it's like being a sports writer when there's, no sports. Mike, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining me again.
Good to be here, Brian. Wish under better circumstances, but we take what we can, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons, obviously, I wanted to talk to you this week, aside from just, being you and being awesome, is that we're in the first full week of the coronavirus COVID-19 quarantine, great quarantine. I don't know what we're calling it, self-distancing, all that. And I wanted to talk to somebody who covers sports for a living about what it's like to have your job when there's no sports. So I guess first of all, just what are you guys doing? What are you doing with your life right now? Like, what are you doing professionally now that you don't have the games to cover?
Well, I spent the last couple of days watching a lot of the Iditarod. I wish I was kidding about that, actually, after having spent all that time watching the Iditarod. But it is the last American thing going on right now, and it's I guess it's fascinating on certain levels. But Brian, what I was telling somebody yesterday, I think what's interesting is it's almost like it's a callback to your roots. I mean, look, when you work at a small paper, as we both did at the beginning of our careers, sure, for 4 months a year we both covered St. Bonaventure basketball, but for the rest of the year, if you wanted to get a byline, you weren't exactly going to be able to rely on, a Bills game or a Mets game or whatever. I mean, you kind of had to figure it out, which really is what journalism is. I mean, you kind of figure out what stories are, and you learn how to tell them, and you talk to the right people. And so really, in a lot of ways, what you're doing is just doing the job the way it was intended to be, and without the games as a crutch. And I don't like to think of the games as a crutch. I like to think of the games as the reason why we do it in the first place. But I mean, in these times, I mean, you have no choice, and it's really sobering the first time you turn on the TV, and I think most cable systems are probably changing it now. But I know the first couple of days it was telling you all the things that were supposed to be on but weren't, and now what you're getting is a bunch of nothing, and so. And so as a sports fan, not just a sports writer, but as a sports fan, that's an adjustment. And I think that's part of, the story that we have to tell is and obviously there are certain days that are different. Yesterday, today with the NFL, there's actually news happening. I mean, around here, we kind of had a little manna from heaven over the weekend because Rick Pitino became the Iona coach. And that story kind of fell out of the sky. So we kind of milked that for a couple of days. So there'll always be news. And unfortunately, somebody will probably die in the next couple of weeks, and they'll probably write an obit about him. And maybe I wouldn't have written otherwise because I just don't have anything else to write about. But I think we go back to what I was saying before. I mean, it's really just a test of kind of remembering why you did this, why you got into it, and what you did back in the day before your days were kind of defined by one game after another.
I want to get back to that, obviously, but I want to go back to last week. So last Wednesday was when the NBA announced it was going dark. The Rudy Gobert situation happened, and I'm wondering, and then Thursday was kind of like the cascade. I think that was the day you guys had the back page of the day the sports went quiet or went black.
Yeah.
I forget, was
Stop,
that
yeah.
the day the sports world stopped. As a columnist, as someone who's charged writing about this, and as a sports fan, just what were those 2 days like for you?
Surreal. I mean, it really was, because it was, it seemed like just a whole lot of half measures the sports world was trying to engage in to try and figure out how to make this palatable for everybody. The whole idea of, first the limited media contact, which I thought was, even when it happened, it was like, that was almost laughable. But then the idea of playing in front of empty stadiums and empty arenas, and that just seemed, too enormous to pull off, and it just seemed like there were problems with that, because there's people going to be in there. It's not really going to be empty, and so it kind of all culminates with that morning when I think in 4 or 5 different conference tournaments, everybody's on the floor warming up, and everybody winds up getting called off the court except for the Garden, where they actually played a half a game between St. John's and Creighton. I wasn't at that game. I was supposed to be at that game, but because there was a global pandemic, I figured it was probably there were probably other things for me, more important things for me to write about. But I mean, it was just bizarre. This game is going on while the rest of the world is basically systematically shutting down, at least the rest of the sports world. And that was, I mean, it was just very strange to watch, because, and look, once that, it's interesting. Once the NBA shut down, it almost seemed that everything else was going to happen that way, even if it took a small or, even if it took longer for that to happen than we ever thought it would. But once that happened, I mean, the dominoes that fell, and I think a couple of them were really harsh. I mean, look, when even if you can see it coming that the NCAA tournament's going to get postponed or canceled as it was, it still kind of hits you like a ton of bricks when it happens. The same thing when you hear about the Masters, same thing when you hear about, the opening day of the baseball season. I mean, one after the other, all these things kind of come tumbling down. And it's just a reminder that things aren't normal, and in a weird way, look, you and I both lived through 9/11 and what that did to the sports world after that. But there was always a sense, even as terrible as times were, that it was very temporary, that we were going to take a little pause. But on the other side, sports was going to be there for us, as it always has been. But this is different. I mean, we can't rely on sports to kind of binding our wounds from what's going on every day. It's part of every day. And that makes a very fundamental difference.
Yeah, one of my students asked me in the sports writing class, what if I had seen anything like this, and this was Friday, so it was as things was happening, and I said the closest thing was 9/11, but even that was different, not just because you knew it was temporary, but because like high school sports kicked in pretty close after 9/11. It was the weekend after, like maybe it meant a week after, I don't remember, but it was that kind of sense of we're not going to have pro sports because of the big gatherings, but you have the local sports, the high school sports, and that kind of like kind of concentric circled out. But now there's really nothing. We got to keep keeping kids safe and canceling high school sports as well. So it's I've used the word unprecedented in my class so much my kids are sick of it, but it really is. I can't think of anything close to something like this.
Look, I mean, during World War II, baseball actually went to President Roosevelt and volunteered to shut itself down and said, if this is what has to happen, it has to happen in, extraordinary times. And even in a global war, President Roosevelt wrote what's famously been called the Green Light Letter, where he told baseball, quite the opposite. We need baseball now more than ever because it's an essential part of American way of life, and it's going to be a distraction for people who need a distraction. And that was really kind of the gold standard. In fact, we all know that Pete Rozelle almost took that advice a little too literally by not canceling games 2 days after President Kennedy was assassinated, but for the most part, that's the thing about sports. At their best, they really are. Look, during 9/11, I mean, I don't want to say that any area's pain or suffering was worse than anybody else, but I wasn't in and around New York in 9/11, which was a tough place to be, and there were a lot of people who were hurting. And look, I mean, even people who didn't like the Yankees, kind of invested themselves in the Yankees as they went on that great run into Game 7 of the World Series, because it was something to think about other than the misery of every day. And that's what sports is supposed to be. And that's what sports is supposed to allow us. And we don't have that now. I mean, it's just, we just don't have it. What's wonderful is, I had a column last week where I suggested about 10 or 15 full games on YouTube to, watch one a day and, occupy your time. Every day there seems to be a pretty cool, question on Twitter or social media, name your 5 favorite. I took part in one yesterday. Name your favorite basketball team with only your favorite players, not the best players. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's going to go on and on for the next couple of weeks, months, however long this takes, and that will be helpful. But the fact is, at the end of the day, there's just no new games to be able to wrap ourselves up in, and you really, I think, forget just how much we think about the dailiness of baseball season, for example, as almost a narcotic. And it really kind of is, and you really appreciate what that means now when it's just not there for you, and you have to kind of quit it cold turkey.
Very nice putting Lanier on your team. I appreciated that, of course.
I wouldn't be allowed back to campus if I put Kareem on instead.
I'm wondering, going back to last week, was there one cancellation, suspension of a league Was there one moment that kind of hit you harder than the other ones?
I think you'll appreciate this, Brian. I actually wrote this. I mean, to me, the moment that it was obvious they weren't going to be able to have fans at the first four.
Mm-hmm.
The last 2 years I've been there, obviously 2 years ago on a happy occasion because of our bodies. Last year I was there with St. John's, a less happy occasion for them. But the great thing about it, nobody wants to be there ever. No, nobody. I mean, even the 16 seeds feel like they're being shortchanged because there are other 16 seeds that aren't being forced to go there. But nobody wants to go to Dayton and play there. Obviously, we remember what it was like 2 years ago. It felt like a snub, not being in the main draw, going to Dayton. And yet when you go to Dayton for those two games, it's such pure, unadulterated basketball joy. Look, I mean, there was a lot of Bonaventure people there 2 years ago, but it was mostly locals who come and fill out every seat there. I mean, at least half of the seats are filled by locals who just come because they love basketball. And that's a sense that really pervades when you're in the building there. I mean, it's a funny, it's kind of a weird experience. Nobody, like I said, nobody wants to be there, and yet once you're there, it's almost an addictive thing, and you really never forget just how much joy is in that building for 2 nights. And when it was out, this is even before it was canceled. Just when they made it clear, when the Ohio governor made it clear that there wasn't going to be able to be a crowd there that night, and they started thinking about playing those games in front of empty arenas. I mean, that's what really hit me the strongest. And look, I mean, someone actually asked me, why did it take that? Because people had actually already died from this thing before that. Maybe that might have been a wake-up call for you. But, as a sports writer and sports fan, I mean, that's what I really thought about was just, those buildings. I mean, that building being empty was, to me, I hate to use the word but we'll use it relative, tragic. And then, of course, when it's not going to happen at all, and of course, then you kind of, tie that into the fact that the home team is the University of Dayton, which, could play basketball for another 55 years and is never going to have a season like this one. And even they know that, and to have that kind of taken from them. I mean, it's almost like the capital of the hurting portion of the sports world for a couple of days has been Dayton.
So I want to get back to what you were talking to a little earlier on getting back to your roots and finding stories now. Because it's interesting, you mentioned the games can be sometimes a crutch for us in sports journalism, and I agree with that. But as you said, and as you know, I don't think there's anything in journalism so tied to its subject as sports is to covering games. And even if you're not writing about the game, the games provide the setting for so much of what we write about, and the bedrock of what we write about. So kind of what are some of the things you're doing now, finding columns? And obviously it's a different job for you, being a columnist, having a little more freedom to write than, let's say, a beat writer or something like that. But where are you looking for stories? What are some of the stories you're looking to tell right now?
Well, I mean, look, I was only half joking about the Iditarod before. Actually, I have been watching the Iditarod because, look, I'm a sports fan looking for sports, and that's kind of the column I'm going to write. And you're right. As a columnist, I can tell that story in a way. No one wants to read a straight Iditarod column, but I think the idea of trying to find sports in a sportsless society. I think that's the column. That's what that's going to get me through today for tomorrow. And I think that's part of it is just kind of, look, part of my daily regimen anyway is reading everything, reading everybody, and trying to get an idea of what's going on and what people are talking about. But, it's trying to have your antenna, I think, a little bit more raised. For instance, Aqueduct is going to start racing again on Friday. I'm not a horse racing guy, but there's got to be an interesting story about, how people are actually going to bet here, because it's obviously the parlors are closed down, the track is down, the fans. You have to figure out this all out online. There's probably a story to be told there. God knows, unfortunately, there's 1,000 stories about high school seniors and college seniors who've had their seasons ripped away from them. And look, there really are transactional things about the sports that in New York that we cover every day. There's no baseball going on, but that doesn't mean that Mets fans stop caring about the Mets or Yankees fans stop caring about the Yankees. And there are a lot of personalities. There was a great column by my colleague Ken Davidoff, who found a minor league player who was going home to Omaha, I think, and found, on his way there, found people playing baseball, having catch, in an instructional league, and they were trying to counterbalance, getting their work in, but also, observing the social distancing, and it turned out to be a fascinating column. So it's a reminder that you really can find, stories in the everyday. I think we're going to rely a lot on history. I mean, a lot on this day, 25, 50, 75 years ago. But I mean, I think there's a way to do that where it's not just a history lesson. I mean, where it's, kind of a lively, relevant, um, thing. And I think that those are the kind of things that we're going to embrace, and and I think we're starting to understand that's how it's got to be. I mean, it's got to be, there's only one way to go about this, and it's to kind of accept it and kind of dig in and just to make the best of it and embrace it, because as we all find out once in a while, sometimes the best stories are the ones we never saw coming, and the ones we never would have expected writing, and yet those are the ones that tend to be our favorites over the long haul.
And you mentioned the history, and I'm talking to the right guy for that, having written a couple history-based sports books, which are great. I'll put links to them in show notes. So if somebody wanted to, if writers listening to this wanted to write history, or about a history story, a history column, and going beyond maybe what's on Wikipedia or what you can find on a quick Google search, what are what's the best way to start doing that? What's some advice that you would give somebody who wants to write the history stuff that you've written?
Well, I mean, now more than ever, it's available to you. I mean, you can go to the Times machine, and you have every New York Times available. There are two newspaper archive services that I, have developed into huge personal rabbit holes: newspapers.com, newspaperarchives.com. They're both, look, I mean, they're both $9 a month, and if that's the kind of thing that you like, it's like almost getting it for free. And these are the kind of things that you can really dive in. And look, the newspapers only provide a portion of real history. I mean, because they kind of give you an idea of what it's like in the moment. And real history is the perspective that it gives you over time. But that's a nice place to start, and it's a good place to get your ideas, and it's a great place to kind of figure out where, how these stories were born and where they emanate from. Obviously, if you're lucky enough, there's been some, maybe there's been a book, or there's been a long form article written about that, and you can find that. But that's really where you start immersing yourself. And I think the place you got to be when you write history is when you do especially if you go through a newspaper for your research, you're not only reading a lot of times the stories that you're looking for, you wind up reading the entire newspaper. And you find yourself almost, if you're reading a newspaper from 1951, suddenly it's a black and white room and you're wearing a fedora and chopping a cigar. And you feel like you're actually reading that newspaper in 1951. And I know that's the mindset that I get a lot of times when I've written these historical stories. And I think it's a great place to be, because it gives you an opportunity to understand the subject in a way that, might not seem possible when you're just reading the words.
So I'm wondering, you mentioned YouTube, and I'll link that column in the show notes as well. But give us one or two of your favorites that you found, or that you're sharing with people, of the old games.
Old games. Well, look, I mean, I think everybody has done everyone has done the obvious ones. The Miracle on Ice is obviously available, so sure, watch that every day if you need to. For Mets fans, they've all seen Game 6 of the '86 World Series. The ones I like are the ones that seem a little more obscure, like the fact, the one that I think I've gotten a lot of feedback for recommending is the ABA Finals from 1976, which is the last ABA game ever contested, and you get to see Dr. J and David Thompson in there, in all their resplendent red, white, and blue glory, playing against each other, so that's one that I enjoy. The 1960 Game 7 is available. The Pirates and the Yankees. That's just great, just because it's a slice in history that you don't see a lot of full games from that are that old. Just about every NCAA Final Four and championship game going back to about 1977 or so is available. And the older you go, the more interesting it is. Especially if sometimes you get one that slips in old commercials; those are kind of fun. So once you get started, I mean, it's amazing how much is out there. And it's funny, somebody actually emailed me and scolded me that maybe the leagues are going to want to take them down off YouTube now that they're available. But as far as I know, they're still available. So I would like to think that in these trying times, nobody's going to go that far.
I can't wait to. I want to actually. I've been thinking about this even before all this. I want to watch old hockey games like from the 70s and 80s because I feel like no sport has evolved. Maybe football, but even I feel like hockey from like the 60s, 70s, and even when I was watching it growing up in the 80s, it just feels like it was played on Neptune. It feels like a completely different sport than it is now.
Well, one of the fun things on Twitter yesterday was I guess in Buffalo they must have been re-showing Game 6 of the '75 finals between the Sabres and the Flyers, and our man Mike Harrington was kind of breaking it down as it was happening. So that was, and I can believe it, because I mean even just watching the Miracle on Ice. I mean I know it's not the NHL, but you watch that game enough, and it really does look like a different game.
So I mean, what are some ways, we talked about finding stories and keeping your antenna up, but kind of thinking more practically, I think, or more kind of hands on, because you're looking for different stories, but again, without the games, without the people in practice having practices or spring training or that, like you don't have the physical access or like the daily kind of running into people that you normally would in journalism. So obviously we have ways to connect with people that we didn't in previous generations, but what are some of the ways that, like, kind of practically, if somebody like has a good story idea, but now how do you go about that in this time? What would you suggest?
Persistence more than ever. I mean, look, I think one of the things that we learned early on in our lives as journalists is the prevalence and the preponderance of the word no. And whether it's looking for a job or trying to get an interview with somebody, I mean, the way I've always described it is it's still great math on our behalf, because for every 99 no's you get, all you need is the one yes, and that seems like a fair game. And that's really what it is. I mean, look, I mean, I think one of the great things about writing a column in normal days, or writing, if you just have a good story, is that people are generally willing to talk to you about stuff. I'm not talking about, if you're doing an investigation, there's, obviously sometimes people want to keep their mouths shut, but generally speaking, if you're just trying to do a good story, people like to help you with that because they understand that. And they're more than willing in a normal occasion. That's the thing that you find that's, I think, more of a challenge now, is I think people are less inclined to just be, chatty, to just be, at least at this point in time. I think people are still kind of overwhelmed by concern. But you know what? I mean, that's part of the trick, though, for what we do, right? I mean, a lot of times, if they're not reluctant to talk to us, they're certainly maybe not be at the beginning quite so open, and it's our challenge to open that up. I think the real challenge is in identifying and figuring out what good stories are. I think this is a great time. It's ironic in a time of social distancing. Thankfully, we have opportunities like this, Brian, where you and I can talk without contaminating each other, and we can actually see each other. But you can do that on a staff basis. You can do that, on a departmental basis. And I think that it's a good time to remember that, while we are kind of individual contract players, we do belong, those of us in newspapers and organized news sites, we belong to a greater team. We have colleagues, and those guys have ideas. And sometimes those ideas don't necessarily fit their skill sets, but they'll fit yours. And I know that, I can just tell you with the Post, we had, kind of an open call late last week for ideas. It's that the editors could kind of ponder and put together. And the one that I saw, a couple of days later, there was probably 70 or 80 ideas. Now 20 of them are awful, and 20 of them are undoable. And maybe, and look, maybe you can poke holes in every one of them. But the fact is, that's not a bad place to start. And that's just from having, drawing ideas from a lot of different creative people. And I think a lot of those ideas could probably be spun off in different ways, into different pathways. And I think that's, that's a key too, is remembering that, I think there's a lot of machismo in this business, no matter what your gender is. I mean, you want to be the guy who does it on your own, but you don't have to. And I think these are times to remember that, you can actually lean on colleagues and lean on other people's ideas in order to make things better for yourself.
So what's one story you would love to do in this gap of however many weeks we're doing? You feel like you have like the whatever Indiana Jones was getting in the first movie, I forget the name of it, but if you had your one thing that you're trying to get, what's that story that you would love to tell more than any else?
Life at a sports book right now, because that's got to be just impossible. Because I mean, that's only just now grown traction. Forget about what you feel about morally about gambling. And the fact is that gambling in about 15 minutes has become just an essential part of what we do. I mean, in the Post, we have 3 pages every day devoted just to and written by the game, by gambling houses. So it's an important part of what we do. And now there's nothing to gamble on. I mean, it's, you can gamble on everything you think, right? But it's just not there. I think that's fascinating. I mean, I think, how about the empty poker room at Binion's, when clearly, whenever they officially canceled the World Series of Poker. Those to me are, there's nothing to me more poignant than an empty stadium. In fact, the very first column I ever wrote, maybe not the first one I wrote, but the first one I wrote in New York when I was in Middletown 26 years ago, was the day that the baseball players went on strike, and I was able to sneak into Yankee Stadium and then just walked around an empty Yankee Stadium for 2 hours. Didn't talk to anybody, and yet I got a column that was bursting with life because there was nobody there. It's interesting when I've always thought that an empty ballpark, empty stadium, empty racetrack, empty casino, we have a lot of emptiness right now. Of course, the trick is gaining access to these empty facilities. But I mean, to me, those are the things that if you could just snap your fingers and be allowed to do things, that would be the first thing I would do. Is, I spent 3 hours walking around Madison Square Garden, just kind of figuring out, kind of listening to the ghosts a little bit.
So I've asked you this last time I had you on the podcast, and I ask everybody, so what's the best thing that you've read lately?
Best thing I've read lately. Wow. I've done I've gone back and read a lot of old New York magazines from the 1970s, 1980s. And then they're available. Go to Google Books, and you can get you have access to every New York magazine. The actual magazines themselves, which is pretty cool. And so, during a 2 or 3 year stretch in 1970, I mean, you had people on staff were Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill and Peter Moss, and it's just one after the other. That's what I've done, and it's amazing how we were always taught that journalism is timeless and good journalism is really timeless, and it really is. When you look about things that were troubling, New York in the 70s, and you have these guys who just and women, Gail Green, who knew how to write about it so expertly. Those are the things that I've really been kind of consumed with lately. I'm reading the John Feinstein latest college basketball book. That's always good, but it's also quite melancholy because it's just a reminder of what we don't have in our daily lives right now.
Right. I just got out of the library the Feinstein book that he did on Coach K, Dean Smith, and Jimmy V. I haven't read that one yet, but I'm looking forward to that one. So
you'll enjoy that.
All right. Well, Vax, stay well, stay healthy, and hopefully we'll have sports to talk about again soon.
Sounds good, Brian. The good thing is that now that I've actually seen Hamilton since the last time you and I talked, I now know what the title of your podcast is all about. So I'm very excited about that.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.